First Kings, the divided kingdom. Last week we got a little bit further than what I thought we would have. We actually got into chapter 12. I really didn't think we would. I have this titled as The Folly of Fools. Out of curiosity, have you ever known anybody who had a position of leadership, whether it was work, whether it was spiritual speaking, in any sense, that in having this position of leadership made them change just a little bit? Made them be just a little bit arrogant maybe, or a little bit bossy? Right? It does that to some people. We need to make sure and understand that just the same as it pertains even in the workforce, people can have that kind of mindset where all of a sudden they get kind of bossy, they get real arrogant and prideful. That can happen just the same in the church. It can happen with spiritual leaders just the same. This could be looked at in this whole chapter right here, chapter 12, as lessons in leadership, because there's a lot of valuable lessons that we can learn from Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Now, just to kind of recap, we had actually gotten through, I think, about verse 10 the last time that we were in the book of Kings. Now, that's been 2 weeks ago, so just kind of a quick recap. Remember, Solomon has now died, and Jeroboam, there at the latter part of the life of Solomon, he had fled. Why did he flee? Huh? Well, it was because of Solomon, actually. Solomon, remember, he was trying to hunt him down because he wanted him killed. Remember, Jeroboam had a prophet tell him that he was actually going to take X amount of the tribes and he was going to rule over them as a king. Solomon apparently got wind of that. He's aggravated about that. He's trying to kill Jeroboam. Where did Jeroboam flee to? Egypt. He went to Egypt. So he fled the scene, right? Well, there at the end of the life of Solomon, you have Rehoboam coming in to be king, and rather than the ceremony, if you will, taking place in Jerusalem, they actually go to Shechem, which is up in the northern area. And this is one of those areas where Jeroboam is ultimately to be king. So it's kind of strange that things take place the way that they do. Nonetheless, that's the direction they go. And in the midst of all of this, Jeroboam comes, and he comes on behalf of the people, and he says, look, your father Solomon, he put heavy burdens on us. And we're kind of hopeful that maybe you will kind of lighten the load a little bit, make things a little bit easier for us. Well, Rehoboam decides, okay, well, come back in 3 days and I'll give you my thoughts on this matter. And of course, he talks with the elders, the wise people, and he says, hey, what do you want me to do here? And they give pretty good advice. They say, look, if you will serve them today, then they will serve you from now on. Right? That was their advice. But what did he do? He went to the young ones. He went to those who were close to him as friends, and he said, okay, now I've heard what they said. What would you say? Right? And they say, well, you make their burdens even greater. Make things even more difficult on them. So the 3 days' time is about up, and he's decided, you know what? I'm going to make it harder for them. Any idea why he would do that? Arrogance, maybe? Yeah, folly of arrogance. That was my thoughts, right? I mean, it seems arrogant to take the information, to take the advice from these older men and say, nah, I don't like that one. We're going to go a different route. I'm fixing to make things way, way harder for you. It seems like a little bit of pridefulness or even a little bit of arrogance combined maybe, but that's his choice of action. Now, one of the questions that was asked last week is, do we suppose that Rehoboam knew why Solomon was trying to have Jeroboam killed? Was Rehoboam aware of what Jeroboam had been told by God, that he was going to take some of these kingdoms? Possibly. Maybe that's the case why these wise men said, look, we can end the conflict here. There doesn't have to be problems. If you will just serve them today, they will serve you from now on. It could be, if he was aware of these things, maybe that's why he said, no, I'm fixing to make things way worse on you. I'm going to make things even harder for you. Speculation, but it seems it might be the case. Let's pick up there in verse 10 through 14, if someone will. Go ahead and read for us 10 through 14.
Then the young man who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, thus you should speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, your father made the yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on them. Thus you shall say say to them, my little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. And now whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king had directed, saying, come back to me the third day. Then the king answered the people roughly, and rejected the advice which the elders had given him. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges.
You know, it seems so strange to think about how this kingdom was in great peace and prosperity and everything was going so well. And somewhere there at the latter part of Solomon's reign, all of a sudden things change. And now you have this workforce, you have this slave labor. And he gives this description like, okay, well, he cracked whips over your back. I'm going to bring scourges. Some translations, depending on your translation, might actually say scorpion there. The idea of like the barbed tail of a scorpion. That's what I'm going to do to you. You think that was painful. You think that was bad. Guess what? It's fixing to get way worse. I'm going to make it even harder on you. Now, I don't know exactly why he took their advice. It's all speculation. Here's one thing that we can learn from it as it pertains to leaders. If leadership begins to cause some sort of arrogance or pride within us, maybe we're not ready for leadership at all. We shouldn't go into leadership and then it begin to change who we are to the point that we become arrogant and prideful. If that's the case, we might need to rethink our position of leadership, right? Yes, sir.
You know, we want to be hard on those people then, but in most cases, when we're young and dumb, everybody comes to us for advice. You get older and you've learned a little bit. Nobody wants to hear what you have to say.
It's completely flipped around backwards, isn't it? Maybe that's the case. I don't know. It's hard to say exactly why he did what he did. The only thing I can think, maybe he did know. You know, it seems like he might have known what was going on between Solomon and Jeroboam. Maybe it was part of the anger that came back. I don't know. But, you know, he took their advice and he said, no, I don't like that. You know, and you see that arrogance and you see that pridefulness kind of come out in his leadership. And all of a sudden, it's creating problems. And you see it, and it's fixing to create a whole bunch of other problems. It's not going to stop just here. Somebody go ahead, if you will, and read verse 15. Read verse 15 for us, please.
So the king did not listen to the people, for the turn of events was from the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken to Ahijah the Shilonite, to Jeroboam the son of the Nebat.
Thanks, sir. All right. Everything that's taking place is still within God's will, right? What God said was going to happen, it is happening, and we're seeing that play out. Well, you ever think about it like this? Maybe like you see how God's providential hand works in people's lives, and you see it especially throughout the Old Testament, and you can say, wow, that's God's hand working through their lives because this is God's will, and we know it for a fact. The text tells us that's God's will. How sad is it to be Rehoboam, and how God's will is going to work out in your life is because of your arrogance and your pridefulness. God is able to use that for his grand plan, but that's what he knows Rehoboam's going to do, and that's how he's going to use him within his will. All of this that takes place, God knew it was going to happen. Nobody's free will was disrupted here, but he knew what kind of heart Rehoboam has, and he knew what to expect. He knew what he was going to do. I wonder at the end of the day, if God's providential hand is working in my life, how am I working into that? Or maybe I'm working in somebody else's life through God's providence to help them out, or maybe hindering something. God knows what I'm going to do. He knows my heart. Is it for the good or is it for the bad? Yes, ma'am.
That makes me think of Genesis chapter, I think it's 18, right before Sodom is destroyed. God, the Lord talking to the angel, says he's going to talk to Abraham and tell him what he's going to do. And the comment he makes about Abraham is that I know him, that he will direct his family to do right. Something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
So he knew Abraham's heart, and he knew whenever he brought the matter to him, that Abraham's response would be one of righteousness.
Right.
So comparing the two, God knew the heart of Rehoboam, and he knew bringing this matter before Rehoboam what was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know, just that intimacy, that intimate knowledge that God has of the man's heart, whether it's righteous or good, he knows what's going to come just because of how that person already acts.
Right. Tying it back, even thinking about with Abraham, and there with Sodom and Gomorrah, and God, how he spoke about Abraham and saying essentially that he knew what Abraham would do would be right. He knew what he would do would be righteous. You know, you tie that to this situation, he knew exactly what Rehoboam was going to do. He knew what his response would be. And remember, what did God tell Jeroboam was going to happen? What did he tell Solomon that was going to happen? The kingdom was going to be divided, right? So now this is God's will playing out, and he was banking, or knew, I shouldn't say banking, he knew for a fact this is how Rehoboam's going to act. Again, at the end of the day, man, I hope if God is working me into his will, that it's something that I'm going to do good and not something that I'm going to do negative, right? All right. Go ahead, let somebody read for us verses 16 through 19. We're going to kind of see the response now after they've been told these things.
Now when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David. So Israel departed to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel who dwelt in the cities of Judah. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the revenue, but all Israel stoned him with stones, and he died. Therefore King Rehoboam mounted his chariot in haste to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel had been in rebellion against the house of David to this day.
Thank you. So basically, Israel sees that the king is not going to respond favorably to them. And immediately here's what their response is, and it somewhat echoes the previous book. What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel, now see to your own house, David. Even back when David was on the run, when Absalom came and rebelled against David, and David's kind of pushed out of his own kingdom, and he fled for a time. Well, he goes to an area that's going to provide him somewhat of protection. Then when things clear up, he's working his way back to Judah, and all of a sudden Israel's like, well, wait a minute, we've been the ones who would protect you. We've been the one that you could come to, and now you're going to turn and go back to your own household where you have all these problems. And they said something very similar, right? They were offended somewhat in that matter. Now you have Israel standing here, and they're saying, look, your father put a great burden on us. Why don't you lighten that load? Well, Rehoboam decides, no, we're going to make it even more difficult. And their response is, what share have we with David? Basically, they're saying, look, this house of David, and it's kind of interesting that they tie it all the way back to David. They don't even reference Solomon. They don't reference Rehoboam, but they tie it back to David, what he's established. And then they say, guess what? This household, it has no care for us. It has no concern for our well-being, so we no longer have no care for it. He's not going to provide for us. He's not going to take care for us. What need do we have to have any kind of tie with them? Tend to your own house, David. Here's that separation. This is such a pivotal moment. Pivotable. I don't know why I struggle with that word, but I do every time. This is such a major moment in their history where all of a sudden now you have these two tribes going in different directions, and they're not going to come back together, right? It's such a major event here, and it all happens. It's fulfilling the will of God, and it all ties back to Solomon knowing all I had to do was do the will of God, and he would maintain my house forever. Things would be great. And he started this whole process when he allowed his wives to worship their foreign gods, and then he even also built some of their altars for them to continue to participate in that. And we're fixing to see some of the ripples or the waves because of his decisions playing out even with everything that's going on here. Now, there in verse 17, all right, Israel, it said there in the end of verse 16, Israel departs for their tents. Verse 17, but Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel who dwelt in the cities of Judah. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the revenue, but all Israel stoned him with stones, and he died. Was he wanting to go collect tribute? I mean, this is the guy, it seems, that would have went and collected tribute They've just said these harsh words to them. And now Rehoboam's first thought is, hey, let's send this guy in there. What do you think they're going to do? I mean, basically send him to his death. I don't know if he's going in trying to collect more tribute or what, but this is a guy who maintains all the revenue. He sends him in. Israel sees him, and all of a sudden they stone him, and he dies. Then what's Rehoboam do? Huh? He takes off, right? He flees. It says with haste. He got on his chariot, and he took off back to Jerusalem. Do you think he understands that Israel means business now? That they're serious about this stand against them? Absolutely. And all of this come about because Rehoboam decided, you know what? That good advice that these wise men gave me, I don't like that plan. But I'm going to talk to these guys, and we're going to do it this way. Now, arrogance started all of this, it seems, but you also now have the folly of division. God does not want his people divided, but because of what they did, that's going to be his will. Continue there in the text, verse 19. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. To the time in which all this is collected and gathered and written, it's what it's saying, to this day, this is how it's been because of these actions. Somebody go ahead and pick up there in verse 20 for us. Read verses 20 through 24.
Now it came to pass, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had come back, they sent for him and called him to the congregation and made him king over all Israel. There was none who followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. And when Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah with the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men who were warriors to fight against the house of Israel, that he might restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, saying, Speak to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, saying, Thus says the Lord, you shall not go up nor fight against your brethren, the children of Israel. Let every man return to his house, for this thing is from me. Therefore they obeyed the word of the Lord and turned back according to the word of the Lord.
Thanks, sir. Okay, so in response.
Did I miss when Jeroboam takes off? Did he just take off of Rehoboam? Because it says like he comes back.
When
Jeroboam had come back, they sent for him and they make him king over all of Israel. So did I miss something, or are we just thinking he split with Rehoboam?
Well, it's almost like when you're flowing through the narrative, they were there at Shechem. This conversation takes place. They reject and say, you know what, it's going to be worse. Then,
So it's not like he split.
no, it's almost like, well, he sends this guy in almost like he's going to get more tribute. They kill him, and all of a sudden he flees back to Jerusalem, Rehoboam.
Okay.
Well, then they take Jeroboam because he's came back from Egypt, and now they're saying, okay, well, we're going to put him in as king. Of course, continuing to follow along with God's will. But when Rehoboam gets back, he's like, okay, now we're going to have to do something back to them. We're going to have to retaliate. And you see how this problem just continues to get worse and worse because of the first original decision. This problem continues to get so much worse. And now what he says, okay, well, let's take 180,000 warriors and we're going to go to war against them. I mean, they're on the brink of a civil war. All because he decided, you know what, I don't want to accept their advice. I'm going to do it this way. Yes, ma'am.
I've always been confused about Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And I know I think I missed your last class. And so I'm trying to wrap my mind around, okay, so Rehoboam was over Judah only, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And Jeroboam was over the rest of Israel?
He
Has
was-
that happened yet, or are we in the process of that?
God had told Jeroboam after Solomon made those really big arrows, he told Jeroboam, you're going to take 10 tribes. Now, when he's told that, Solomon finds out, apparently, because Solomon says, you know what, I want him dead, so he flees to Egypt. Jeroboam does. And then at the end of Solomon's life, Jeroboam comes back, and now we're seeing God's will fulfilled, and the people are placing him as their king, but they're taking the 10 tribes. Rehoboam, Judah. Of course, Benjamin is lumped in with that, and that's why there's just mention of Judah as one, because those are already somewhat combined as one. So you have Rehoboam and Judah, and then you have Jeroboam with 10 tribes, basically the northern tribes. And now because of what had taken place, Rehoboam is ready to go to war to bring Israel back, to take all of them in under his control. When I first read through this text and I was looking at this, the first picture, and I don't know, this is just the way I was thinking about it. You know, like when you're a kid and say your parents leave you alone for like 5 minutes and they come back and you've just messed up all kinds of things and their first response is, I only left you for 5 minutes, right? And all kind of things are messed up. And it's almost like God has stepped back just a little bit here because he knew their hearts, knew what they were going to do. He allows them to do their thing, and all of a sudden he has to step in and intervene just a little bit and say, okay, now slow down. You're not going to go to war against each other. So he sends this prophet. And the prophet tells Rehoboam, hold on, hold your horses. You're not going to go to war against your brethren. So he stops this war that's going to take place. But it was right there on the verge of it. Okay. Questions, thoughts?
I was going to say props to Rehoboam for actually listening and not going to war.
Right. I thought about that too because it's so strange. If Rehoboam knew what Jeroboam was told and why Solomon was going after him, right? He would have known that Jeroboam was told that he would rule over these 10 tribes. I would assume if I'm Rehoboam and I come in to reign, I'm going to be doing everything that I can to hold on to all the tribes because I wouldn't want to let go of any of the tribes. And you're thinking, okay, at what point in my reign are these tribes going to be taken away from me? And then it's like, well, we're fixing to go to war, and this prophet comes in and says, no, you don't need to do that. And I mean, it's like he just steps back. Like, okay, like maybe he did know what was coming in the sense of he knew the division was coming, just didn't know exactly how or when. Mm-hmm.
Just looking at the wording, when it says, they hearken, therefore, to the word of God, it almost sounds like his army just dispersed on him. Because it doesn't say specifically, I mean, it almost seems like he didn't have a choice. Like, he didn't go to war, but they hearkened. And on the one hand, I'm sure the nobles and like the upper class would have wanted the other tribes back because they just lost half their income, like immediately. Like their whole way of life just took a huge whack. Mm-hmm. But everybody else, like, that's our brothers. Like, that's our family. Like, they couldn't have wanted to go to war. And now God's telling them not to. I mean, if he hadn't have listened to God, I mean, he risked losing the only bit of the kingdom that he had left if he went against God and the people at this point. Right.
I mean, and they immediately, it's like the way it does explain it, it sounds as if they're like, okay, well, let's just step back and, this is God's will. Don't need to push this any further. Yes, sir.
A lot of times we do just like Rehoboam is about to do because we get ourselves into some trouble and we have this situation on our hands that, well, if we'd have done something different here, I wouldn't be in this mess that I'm in right now. So in order to fix it, sometimes we think we need to go, we need to fight, we need to work harder, do all these things. And if Rehoboam goes and does this, all he's going to do is create more and more problems and an even greater division than what's already there. And so a lot of times we find ourselves in the same situation when the best thing to do is simply to stop and just do what God says.
Right. Turn back to his word, conflict resolve, rather than continuing to go off of our own emotions or our own desires. Stop, slow down a minute and think about what, for this, it was God's word through a prophet. But we can easily apply that even to our lives today when it comes to conflict. Sometimes it's just slow down and cool the jets and think about God's word and what we're doing. Who knows how many lives would have been taken if they actually would have went into this war against each other. 180,000 warriors that are fixing to go to war to try and bring all the tribes back to Rehoboam. It would have been a bloodbath, I would assume. So the Lord speaks. This is not going to happen. They stop. Now, we're fixing to see some of Jeroboam's response in this, and this is more of the part I was wanting to get to this evening. We'll see if we can get through this, but the folly of self-preservation. If someone will Go ahead and read verses 25 through 27 for us.
And Jeroboam built Shechem in the mountains of Ephraim and dwelt there. Also he went out from there and built Peniel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam, king of Judah.
Okay, so we get this little glimpse. Jeroboam builds, it says Shechem in the mountain of Ephraim, as well as Peniel, which both of these places were already established. And you might actually have a notation there in your Bible as fortified. So he fortified these areas. This, I guess, somewhat like homestead for him. This is where he's going to be located. But then as he's there, he gets to thinking, what is the problem he begins to think about?
Or the Israelites are going to worship.
Right. He starts thinking, okay, now I have these northern tribes. Well, when they go to worship in Jerusalem, it may be the case, when they go, they're going to stay there and their allegiance will shift back to Rehoboam. And if that's the case, then why do they need me? Then they'll kill me. Yes, sir.
So he's kind of saying, like, he knows how Rehoboam feels.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's trying to feel out how the people feel.
Right.
Follow Rehoboam.
He's worried that they might, switch their allegiance and start following Rehoboam.
The people that are following him already.
Yeah, the ones that are following Jeroboam, the northern tribes. So he has these northern tribes, and he's now the king. They elected him in there, right? And that's God's will. But his first thought is, man, when everybody starts going back to Jerusalem, how hard would it be for him just to say, you know what? Why are we doing this? Why don't we just maintain our allegiance with Rehoboam? So Jeroboam starts getting a little bit fearful. And this is where you see the self-preservation start kicking in. So to maintain his kingship, what's he decide to do? He's going to wind up doing things that are completely against the will of God, right? Well, what had God told him? That he would rule over the 10 tribes? What else did he tell him? Keep his commandments. And if he did, what was going to be the case? He would reign. He would maintain his house. Very similar to the promises that were made to Solomon. Very similar to the promises that were made to David. Same promises in some sense were made to Jeroboam. He says, look, all you have to do is keep my commandments. Right?
But they didn't have the Levites with them, so they didn't have the priesthood. So how were they going to do that?
We're fixing to see that. He has to break a lot of laws to accomplish what he's fixing to do. And he starts making this decision because he's fearful of what the people might do. He's afraid that they're going to turn their allegiance back to Rehoboam. So now his first thought is, where can I compromise? Right? He says, okay, what can I do to make it more convenient for the people? He says for the people, but who's it really geared toward? Him. It's what's in his best interest. How often is it the case in the church today that people might quickly do what's more convenient? Make changes based on what they want, what's best for them? I mean, that's exactly what he's doing here. Yes, sir.
The Levites still had cities in those. The Levites still had cities in those areas, though, right? Because they didn't live in Jerusalem. They lived in all.
They were scattered.
Because he didn't. I mean, when he gave the 10 tribes to Jeroboam, the 2 that he gave to Rehoboam was Judah and Benjamin, not the Levites.
Right.
So the Levites are still there, so they still traveled. They still did because the rotation.
I guess they might have. Yeah. But what we're going to see is he selects beyond the Levites.
Right. Yeah,
Right.
I know the rest of the story. I'm just saying the Levites are still there.
They would have still had some in their midst, I guess, then. Possibly, yeah. That's a good point.
Unless they did flee, but.
Right.
I wonder why he didn't go to them, because they were the priests.
I wonder how much of that is you would hope that the priest of all people would see what he is doing and say, that's a terrible idea. That's not how this is supposed to be. You would think. Maybe that's the case, I'm not sure. Do you have something, Alex?
So figure out the timeline here. So in 2 Chronicles 11, verses 13 and 14, it talks about how after the kingdom split, the Levites left their cities and fled to Judah, the tribe of Judah. So they
would have been gathered together with them.
Yeah, so they did stay, they were in the northern kingdom, they did have cities, but it says, verses 13 and 14, that the priests and Levites that were in all Israel resorted to him out of all their coasts, for Levites left their suburbs, their possessions, and came to Judah and Jerusalem, for Jeroboam and his sons had cast them off from executing the priest's office under the Lord. So he basically fired them from being priests. But if you look at it from a very worldly mindset, like Jeroboam, you have the kingdom just split. But Jerusalem and the temple, the great temple that they worshipped more than they worshipped God, was still under Rehoboam's control.
Right.
So if he left all of that as it was, well, everyone's going to make their pilgrimages, and everyone's going to go sacrifice, and then they're going to be like, well, do we really need to split? So from a worldly standpoint, it made sense to offer them another option to have self-preservation.
Oh, yeah.
So that they'll stay under his control.
To maintain his kingship. Right. In 2 Chronicles, there's actually a spot that mentions the Levites actually working their way back to Judah because of fear of what Jeroboam would have actually done to them and possibly having them killed off. So they worked their way back to Judah, so then that means all Levites likely would have been in that area, and kind of helps push to what we're fixing to see Rehoboam do. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, Jerusalem is on the border between Benjamin and Judah. And that's where the temple was in Jerusalem. So he's afraid if they have to go back to Jerusalem to worship, then they'll be influenced to
Right.
return.
That's where they would have had to worship though.
Yeah. Right, and they would have understood that by now, because things, it seemed, as far as worship, other than what Solomon had done for his wives and building these other areas of worship, things seemed to have been going pretty well up to the point that he did that. So the people would have been in good rhythm of doing, what they were supposed to do as it pertains to worship. But then let's go ahead and read and see what his idea is, or the plan that comes about. If someone will, go ahead and read verses 28 through 30.
Therefore the king asked advice, made 2 calves of gold, and said to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt." And he set up one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Now this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. He made shrines on the high places, and made priests from every class of people who were not of the sons of Levi.
Thanks, sir. So here's his plan. We'll set up something elsewhere, therefore they don't actually have to go back to Jerusalem, and we'll build these golden calves. That ring any bells? Right? And he says, these will be your gods, and this is what you'll worship. Now, it's one thing to hear this coming from Jeroboam. He knew what he was supposed to do. God had already told him. Yet here's his plan, because he doesn't want to lose his position. He wants to maintain his kingship. Pretty awful that he did this. But guess what? We're not going to hear a peep about anybody rejecting this idea. That blows my mind. You would think at least somebody would say, man, that's a horrible idea. We're going to go to Jerusalem. We know where we need to worship. We know what we need to do. We know what pleases God. And it's like nobody says anything but like, hey, that's more convenient. That sounds great. Let's go with that. Yes, sir.
You think about how the Levites were the teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it says a little bit about how much teaching they were actually doing, because we don't see it. But at the same time, you look at Jeroboam, the position he's in, you get rid of the teachers, and you make whoever you want to be a teacher. You can do whatever you want to do. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely right. Because what we do see him do is he starts making, these priests out of anybody. I mean, anyone and everyone. He's making them priests, and he is allowing them to do priestly duties at these other locations that he set up, and it's all for convenience. He says it's for the convenience of the people. He says, hey, this is better for you. Look, that's a long ways. Man, that's a tough journey. Now, that's what he told them, but how much of that might already been in their minds? I mean, if they bid on this that fast, nobody rejected it, and they accepted it that quick, this is likely what they already thought. You know what? This worshiping God, man, this is difficult. I have to travel all the way to Jerusalem. I have to go on these feast days. I have to do this. It is such a hassle.
You think maybe they were afraid to go back to Rehoboam though? Maybe they were a little bit leery of going back there?
Maybe, but man, you sure would think they'd be more afraid of God than they would have been of, of him. Got one here, and then I'll come back to you, Jesse. Yes, sir.
Kind of scary how much less convincing he had to do for how quickly they accepted this, because he didn't really have to do as much convincing as they did for them to follow God as Moses had to do, or
Right.
anybody else had to do. He said almost no words at all.
That's a really good point.
And how scary it is compared to us, our path following God.
That's right.
How much easier it might be for us to turn our backs on the faith.
That's right. It can be so difficult, and it can take so much effort to get somebody to turn their life toward God. But in so many cases, it seems like just a matter of moments, and all of a sudden they can be turning their life away from God, and that's what we're seeing here. Absolutely, that's a good point. Yes, sir.
Just 2 Chronicles 11:13 through 17 is,
The parallel.
yeah, it has just a little bit more information on just that part, so if you want to read that.
We'll probably look at it in our next class. We're about to run out of time.
You got like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
How different is it today? Though we see time and time again in so many places, with have an announcement, the elders have met, studied, prayed, and come to a conclusion that we can introduce this, whatever unscriptural act in, and the people just go right along with it.
Follow suit, right?
I
Because
think this would be
that's
an
right.
exception, but generally, that's what happens, and then what? Then they're all become apostate.
That's right.
And
These,
same principle.
yeah, these same things happen still today all around the world, where leaders will make decisions that are for the worse, and the people just follow suit, just like they did here. Seems like maybe these are some of the things that they were thinking already, and they jumped on board in a hurry. And it can very easily happen just the same, with today's leaders. It's a great lesson that we can learn, just looking. Now, granted, the decisions that they were making were not easy. I'm not trying to make light of the decisions that they were making. They weren't easy decisions. There's difficult decisions that had to be made. But you can see how quickly, when the leader decides, here's what we're going to do, everybody else follows suit. Whether it's 180,000 men getting ready to go to war against their brothers, or 10 tribes turning away from God and saying, we're going to worship these calves. Thank y'all for your attention.